Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for everyone joining in this evening. I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Jaime Del Rio, and I'm Abundant Housing LA field organizer, and I'll be your moderator this evening. Before we start, let's take some time for a land acknowledgement. Abundant Housing LA recognizes and acknowledges the first people of its ancestral and unceded territory at Titavian and Gabrielino Tongva that is now occupied part of Assembly District 43 in the city of Burbank, honors their elders past and present and the descendants who are citizens of Gabrielino Tongva and Fernandino Itabian Band of Missions Indians. We recognize that the tribe is still here and we are committed to lifting up their stories, culture, and communities. So Abundant Housing is a nonprofit organization that its mission is to address the upstream causes of housing crisis and housing shortage and build a movement of structural change so that LA becomes a place of abundant housing. Why is abundant housing so important? There's a few main reasons for that. One of them being more affordable housing. Multi-family apartment buildings are cheaper per unit than single family homes. But even though so many people need a place to live, most of LA is still zoned for housing scarcity through a density suburban sprawl. Environmental sustainability. Imagine if we could live near where they work and could walk, bike, and access transit. It will mean less sprawl and destruction of the environment, more energy efficient buildings, and fewer GHG emission. Our main goal is to achieve abundant housing throughout advocacy, policy, and education to shift LA culture to see housing as a positive thing. So we are here today to discuss Burbank and state and local housing policies and on how we can plan for an equitable and impactful housing element update, prioritize affordable housing production, ensuring renters protection, and meeting state and global climate goals and fire adaptation. We'll begin with a panel discussion where I'll ask questions to our panelists, and there will be an opportunity for a Q&A towards the end of discussion. So let's begin by introducing to our two panelists we have this evening. We have here Assemblywoman Lauren Friedman, who was elected to California State Assembly in November 2026 to represent the 43rd Assembly District. Her legislative work is focused in three primary areas: addressing the housing affordability and homeless crisis, combating climate change, and protecting vulnerable communities. Lauren recognized as a steadfast advocate for the environment, sustainability, communities, and active transportation. In 2020, she was appointed to serve as chair of Assembly Committee on Transportation. Laura's appointment as chair marked as a shift toward forward-thinking policies such as investing in mass transit, bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure, zero-emission vehicles, road safety, and sustainability. Welcome, Assemblywoman. Thank you for having me here. Our next panelist is Burbank Councilmember Nick Schultz. In November 2020, Nick Schultz was elected to the Burbank City Council after receiving a second highest number of votes in the city history for the city council race. Nick currently serves as liaison for the Burbank Police Commission and Sustainable Burbank Commission, as well as a member of the Fiscal and Treasury Review Group. Nick serves as a member of Southern California Associations of Governments, Communities, Economic and Human Development Committees. He also represents the city of Burbank as a member of the Valley Economic Alliance as an alternative member of the Arroyo Verdugo Communities Subregion Joint Power Authority. Nick and his wife, Ali, an attorney, is an entertainment industry attorney in the entertainment industry, resides in the historic Rancho neighborhood of Burbank with their daughter, Ella, and their two cats, Liam and Lily. All right, well, thank you both for joining us this evening. I would like to thank you for having council member and Assemblywoman here. So we'll begin with our first questions here I have this evening. So the first question I have here for you guys is, how can local government contribute to meeting state and global climate goals?
Well, hi, everybody. I want to thank everyone who's watching right now. And I want to thank Abundant Housing for giving us this opportunity to come and talk about housing. when it was suggested that we do a town hall together about housing, I have to say that some of my staff thought we were crazy to jump into the housing issue because it is one of the most controversial and divisive issues that our community is dealing with. But I really think that it's very important that elected officials always have an ongoing and open dialogue with their community and with the stakeholders about every issue, and particularly the issues that are difficult. And housing is, in many ways right now in Los Angeles, one of our biggest challenges and one of the most difficult issues. So if you don't mind, before I answer your question, I wanted to just give a little bit of context as to why housing is kind of what it is, something that is on the forefront of people's minds more than almost any other issue. First of all, we all see the waves of homeless residents growing all the time. And there's certainly a lot of huge concern from everybody in the community, a lot of questions as to why this is happening and how we stop this from happening. And, it's a complicated subject, and we could have a town hall just about homelessness, but it is certainly connected to what's happening in housing. And that's something that's very visible for people. But what's a little bit less visible is the stress that a lot of our residents who are working and productive residents as well are having with housing. And first, let me say that the homeless population that we see on the streets is one subset a lot of times of the homeless. And a lot of people in our community volunteer in our shelters. And in Glendale, for instance, we have Essentia, which is an amazing facility. And a lot of our nonprofit groups and a lot of our residents go and serve meals at Essentia. And what people often say when they first go there is that they're very surprised at the population that they are serving. That the people who are in a lot of our emergency shelters and who are looking for services are not the same population of the homeless that we think of when we see the tent cities. They are people that are working in our communities. They are people who go to work in a car every day or get on a bus. There are people who have children. There are a lot of times senior citizens who have been members of our community for a long time, but find themselves homeless because they just can't keep up with their rents. So there's really a wide variety of people who are homeless. There are students who couch surf, who don't have a place to stay every day. So this is really a very complicated issue that affects a lot of people. So why do we have this crisis? First of all, just to give some context, there are over 160 homeless Californians, 160,000 homeless Californians. That's a huge population. Only 27% of households in California can afford to purchase the median single-priced home, which is 50% less than the national average. Now, I'm somebody who believes that, yes, people should absolutely have the opportunity to rent and to rent at a position they can afford. But I also believe that owning a home offers people a kind of security and a kind of that chance to the American dream. And I do think that home ownership is also very important to make sure that that's attainable to a lot of people and not just to the kind of the elite residents in our community. And that's slipped away more and more from being reachable by the average family. Over half of our renters and 80% of low-income renters are rent burdened, meaning that they pay over 30% of their income to rent. And that's even worse in our local communities, I'll get to. In the local level in Burbank, 54% of renters, 54% are paying over 30% of their income towards rent. So no matter what end of the economic scale you're at, that is a huge burden for our renters. And they're also a lot of times are always wondering if that rent's going to increase even more to beyond 30%. Now, the average rent in Burbank, and by the way, I know that there's people watching this from all over the district. Because we have Councilmember Nick Schultz here from Burbank, we are going to be talking a lot about Burbank, but a lot of these issues are applicable to other areas. So I apologize, people in Glendale, that we're going to use a lot of Burbank statistics today. So the average rent in Burbank is about almost $2,300 a month for 800 square feet of rent. 800 square feet, which is, pretty small if you're a family of 3 or a family of 4, and yet you're paying almost $2,300 a month in rent. So that's really difficult for a lot of our families, a lot of our residents. Well, the House of Housing in LA County impacts renters and homeowners quite differently. For renters, housing costs take up on average 37% of their household income, 37%. For homeowners, the housing cost accounts for 25% of their income. So we already see that people who are lucky enough to be homeowners enjoy a lot of advantages that our renters really can't reach right now. Major costs of our housing crisis is the mismatch between supply and demand of housing. Now, it's not the only reason, and we have to acknowledge that, but it is a reason. For decades, California's household population has been growing at a faster rate than its housing supply. Between 1990 and 2017, the population expanded about 34.4%, whereas the housing supply only increased 25.8%, or about 32 new housing units for every 100 new residents. I remember when I moved to Los Angeles in 1992, I found my first apartment by literally driving up and down the streets of Hollywood. And there were dozens of for rent signs almost on every single street. There was a lot of competition between renters. And at the time, which was 3 decades ago now, you could rent a 1 to 2 bedroom apartment for $500 a month. So it was a very, very different story then. And I will just put it into context of income. I was a kind of entry-level film person at the time. I was not making a huge exorbitant salary, and yet I was able to afford a decent apartment on my own without being, overly rent burdened. That has very much changed for the same population of workers. So by comparison, in the rest of the United States, where many of the rest of the US cities also acknowledge that they have a housing crisis, but the rest of the US has added approximately 40 new housing units for every 100 new residents over the same period. The excess demand correlates with much lower vacancy rates and larger household sizes and higher housing prices. And in a lot of Los Angeles, we have 2-3 families occupying a unit that was designed for one family because of that shortage of housing. So I know that there are people who believe we have a huge excess of housing sitting on the market vacant, and there's a little bit of that, but not to the amount that would actually make a difference in terms of our crisis. In LA County alone, our population grew by 765,399 people between 2000 and 2018. Our housing production only grew by 184,245 units, just to put that in scale. Now, to address this gap, California needs approximately 2.6 million units of housing, including 1.2 million units to lower income households. And so even if we built all of these units, we'd still need 180,000 units of housing built every year to keep up with demand. By contrast, production in the past decade has been under 100,000 units per year, further exacerbating the housing crisis. And this is statewide. This is not just a Burbank problem. This is not just an LA problem. It's a statewide issue. But of course, it's worse in the areas where we've added the most jobs. And we've added a lot of jobs in Los Angeles and in Burbank without producing the housing for those residents. Now, lower production has not always been a problem. From 1955 to 1990, we were producing over 200,000 units annually statewide, and a much greater percentage were multifamily as opposed to today's focus on single family units. California's current population of 39 million people is expected to grow to 50 million residents by 2050. And if we don't focus on more sustainable housing planning, we'll be pushing development further away from where we have our jobs, which leads to a lot more congestion on our highways. And then projects like the Tejon Ranch and Newhall Pass, where they're proposing adding hundreds of thousands of units out in what's right now open space and areas that are far away from transit, that are in high fire zones a lot of times. And that would eat up what a lot of us think of as being precious natural resources in our state. So there are trade-offs to not allowing building near job centers. And if we also say, well, we're kind of full, we're not going to add more, we don't want more people, it's not the case that people don't come. People still have children live. We still have people coming for jobs keep increasing. And, you have this situation where you have to say, well, who gets to live here and who doesn't? Is it only wealthy people who get to live here? Who works in the service industry jobs, and where do they have to live? And how far do they have to travel to get to work? So these are complicated trade-offs. And I'm not saying that I particularly want our population to grow, but I don't know really what you do about that. So, I lay this out to say that there are problems here and there's a crisis here that we all have to face. So the challenge is more than just a shortfall in units. Having less units of housing than we have population leads to increased inequality and a lack of opportunities. So that compounds growing inequality, where we limit the advancement opportunities for people, for younger Californians. And I hear a lot from constituents that there's no place for their children to live. You know, they say, well, my kids are at home and I want them to live in their own place. They're 25, 30 years old, but they can't find an apartment that they can afford. So it's our own kids that are, you know, kind of suffering from this and being forced to move further away. And again, you know, the housing growth is being concentrated now in areas where we don't have the jobs. So that leads to, you know, longer commutes and a lot of issues. Obviously, too much of people's income is going towards rent. And that, you know, creates a lot of economic problems. It leads to where, in a situation where people can't save. They can't save for that rainy day, for an illness. They can't save up to have a down payment on a house. And we see a lot of people, because of increasing renting prices, becoming homeless they didn't expect to. And one of the largest populations of homeless on the streets, growing populations, is senior women. So think about that. If a woman is in her 80s or 85 years old and her rent goes up dramatically and her fixed income can't compensate for that, there's not a magical rent fairy that comes in to pay her rent. And a lot of times those people end up not having the family structure or the support, or maybe they're embarrassed to ask, and they end up at a shelter, they end up homeless. And there's just not enough affordable housing or subsidized housing to house that population. Again, we have fewer people becoming homeowners, fewer young families are unable to become homeowners. I personally think that that's a problem. And a disproportionate number of Californians are becoming homelessness. And this is leading to more despair, people feeling there's no place for them in California, people wanting to leave the state. And, you know, it's a problem. So you asked again how, I think your question was how local governments contribute to meeting state and local climate goals. Am I correct? I think that I'm going to let Nick start with that, and then I'll come back and maybe talk a little bit again to answer that question. And I don't know if Nick had opening comments, but I want to also, I mean, this isn't my town hall, it's your town hall, abundant housing, but I feel like we should give the council member a chance to make some opening comments too before we jump into the questions.
For sure. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, thank you all. I'm going to keep it brief because I want to get to the meat of the issues. But first of all, to Abundant Housing LA, thank you so much for the invitation to be part of today. To the Assembly member, it's an honor to share the floor virtually with you and to talk about these issues. I did want to just make a few acknowledgements. We're joined today by Councilmember Sharon Springer, former Mayor Emily Gable-Luddy, Deputy City Planner Scott Planbeck, Senior Planner Lisa Frank, and so many others. And thank you all for joining today. So I'd like to start by, first of all, thanking you, Assembly member, for walking through, you know, the history of the housing crisis that we face, not only in the community of Burbank, but throughout the state. And I would just say this, this is a problem that is decades in the making, and we could talk at hours on end about how we've gotten here. My focus is how we move forward. And I think that the only way that we can move forward is by having conversations like these together. Now, we may disagree on the means to the end. You know, there is real issues that we have to talk about when it comes to local control. But here's what I would say. I believe that we are facing a crisis of our generation when we talk about homelessness and housing, and we have to have these conversations together because, especially as a council member, if we are not talking about job growth and creation, the environment, housing, homelessness, then we're not doing our jobs. And I also think that when we talk about finding solutions together, we have to acknowledge the fact that local governments have local responsibility to meet this challenge with innovative and creative solutions. And I firmly believe in my bones that when we're talking about a unique community like Burbank, the Burbank solution is going to be best for our community. And so I look forward to talking with you today about how we can work together and how we can find that common ground, because clearly there's a problem. And I want to acknowledge that, you know, there is common ground even in this hotly contested topic. I want to credit the prior city council before I joined, who had the vision of setting a strategic benchmark of adding 12,000 units of housing by 2035 as part of our general plan. That tells me that there is a shared sense of we are all in this together, and together we can find the solution. So with that, Assemblymember Friedman, do you want to answer the question first and then I'll take it up, or how would you like to do it?
Well, sure. I'll just say, you know, I come from local government. I was on the Glendale City Council for almost 8 years. And before that, I spent 5 years on the Glendale Design Review Board because I care a lot about our community, about the built environment, about our experience with our community, that making sure that our buildings are, you know, are high quality, that our development fits in with our community. I spent many years working on exactly those issues. I worked on developing the hillside design guidelines in Glendale and making sure that our development was appropriate, not out of scale. And when people developed, that they respected their neighbors, that they, made sure that what they did contributed to their community, contributed to the neighborhood, and didn't harm it. And that's something that's been important to me since my time as an elected official and as an appointed commissioner. And before that, I worked for years doing historic preservation work with the LA Conservancy all around Los Angeles County, because preserving the parts of our built environment that we love, that give us a sense of place and a sense of identity, is really important to me. And it's that work that actually led me into politics. So I understand people's connection to the community that they have. I understand why people are so passionate about the way that their communities develop. And I do think that we do need to make sure that whatever we do is additive to our communities, that it improves everybody's quality of life, that we're thoughtful about how we build, because buildings last a really long time. And when they're done badly, they can diminish people's quality of life. They can lead to blight. They can lead to the exact kind of bad effects that we don't want to have happen in our community, like communities where people do have to drive a lot, where there is no green space, where we have bad air quality, where people don't enjoy living. So and those kinds of oversight decisions are best when they're done locally. When communities have a strong hand in looking and evaluating their communities and looking at areas that work really well and saying, we want to kind of leave those areas the way they are, and looking at other areas that aren't working so well, that actually could benefit from reimagination, from redevelopment, from adding more people, to changing the streetscape, to adding green space. I think that it's much better to do that in conjunction with the community and certainly with local governments. I do believe that we do have to have regional goals, because otherwise these housing issues really become exacerbated and the impacts spill over into other areas. They don't stay contained. They lead to traffic impacts. They lead to inequities. But I think that if the state helps guide some of those, along with the local planning agencies like SCAG, the Southern California Association of Governments, which Nick serves on and which I used to serve on, and coming up with regionally how we're going to manage that growth, but then allow those decisions to be made at the local level for exactly those additive effects. That is definitely the best way for us to move forward. And I will say also that one of the reasons that people resist density in Los Angeles is because we've done density so badly in so many cases, because of the way that we've done land use and the way that land has been valued. What we end up doing a lot of times is seeing entitlements for a 300-unit apartment building kind of in the middle of nowhere, maybe near a highway, where the people who live there can't walk and bike anywhere, where it's not near a job center, and where that development is overscale compared to the surrounding neighborhood. And of course, people don't want that. So when they hear about adding new things, they have that in their mind and they say, well, I don't want that in my neighborhood. You know what? I don't necessarily want that in my neighborhood either. But there is development that works in a more neighborhood scale, development that's lower scale, that's lower impact, that is additive, that can add multifamily, that are, those 8-plexes, those 4-plexes that do give the opportunity for more growth and more density, but without being things that are out of scale or overwhelming for communities. And then we have communities that have special needs, like our Rancho community, where we have horsekeeping, affordable horsekeeping in Los Angeles. That's really special. We're doing high density, wouldn't be appropriate. So I think that it's the locality, the local governments that are best suited to make those decisions, but they do have to make those decisions. They can't, kind of say we're closed. When they really could be when they're overwhelmed with, people who are driving in every day to work and don't have a place to live. So, and where rents are getting higher and higher because we don't have enough rental stock for the people who want to live there. And when we're facing homelessness, we also have to find a way of striking that balance.
I couldn't agree more, and I'll jump in there, and then I promise I will get to the question. Yeah. But I think that's absolutely right, and let's bring it home. Let's bring it to something we can all relate to. My wife Allie and I welcomed our daughter Ella to the world just a couple months ago, and the reason I bring that up is when I think about housing, it's something that I'm passionate about personally, because I want a community where Ella can afford to live when she grows up, an apartment that she can afford to rent, and hopefully one day a home that she can afford to buy. So we obviously do need to act locally, and I have tremendous confidence and faith in our Burbank planning staff, our planning board, our city council. And my message on a personal note, my message to you, Assembly member, and to anyone else watching is that Burbank is ready to do the work. We're going to add housing, but we're going to add it where it makes sense, for the very point that you said. There are so many unique aspects to our community. We have a rare find. We have an equestrian neighborhood in Los Angeles, and where else do you find that? We have to protect that, and we have to preserve it. But we also have to look at underutilized opportunities, unused spaces in our community. We have an old IKEA location. We have an old Kmart location. We have commercial corridors in the Golden State District where there is opportunity to add housing that makes sense. But I think that the important way that we go about doing it is by listening to our neighborhoods, by making sure that if we do decide to add housing opportunities, that it fits with the neighborhood's character, that we're listening to the residents, that it incorporates the architectural design. All of these things matter. And it's my way of saying that I think that we truly have to have a surgeon's approach. We can't use a one-size-fits-all method. And I completely share your vision that I think that Burbank is up to the task, and I think that that's throughout the district. It's going to be local governments partnering together and finding solutions that fit for us. So the question, as I understand it, was, how can local governments contribute to sustainability? I think that there's a couple things that we're doing in Burbank that I'm very, very proud of. Right now, we're in the process of updating our greenhouse gas reduction plan, and that's going to be something to stay tuned and watch for later this year. But we're looking at ways to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. But we also can get really local really fast. We are currently in the process of, we're going to be talking soon about the status of our single-use plastics ban and the idea of a skip the stuff ordinance, which many communities are including right now, which essentially says, restaurants don't give over those plastic utensils and napkins and all those things unless asked for by the customer. With regards to building, right now the Sustainable Burbank Commission has been batting around the idea of an updated ordinance that would require, as I understand it, all electric building design. Those are the kinds of things we can look at as well. Pushing our utility in Burbank Water and Power, to 100% renewables as soon as possible. That's going to be key as well. There's so much that local government can do when it comes to meeting these targets. And Assembly member, I think you hit it right on the nose. In many, many ways, Sacramento and even the county are going to look at it from the regional perspective and say, this is where we need to get. These are the targets that we need to meet. But I keep coming back to this term of local responsibility. It is local government that needs to be where the rubber meets the road. We need to be the ones pushing forward and saying, we're going to meet those targets, but we're going to meet them in a way that fits our community's needs. In the context of renewable energy, we're going to hit that target, but we're also going to factor in the affordability, right? We have to keep an eye on those rate increases. We have to make sure that the energy remains affordable, and there is a way to do it. And I fundamentally believe that this is an exciting time in Burbank. We are pushing forward on all of these issues. Housing plays a significant role in it, but I would actually love to hear your thoughts, Assembly member, on how can the state partner with local governments like Burbank to make sure that we're contributing to a greener, more sustainable future?
Well, I will say that I think that giving local governments more resources to help do this work is really important from the state. I have authored a bill this year, AB 1147, that is about helping the cities plan to reduce vehicle miles traveled, meaning reduce the time that people need to spend in their cars by doing land use planning a little bit better to make sure that people are able. There's a concept that's become popular in Europe called the 15-minute city. And the idea is that everybody should be within a 15-minute walk, bike ride, or transit ride of the things that they need in their life, like groceries, childcare, all the things that you kind of need in your everyday. You should be able to get to them without having to drive for an hour. So how do we change the way that we use land to make that more feasible? I'll give you an example. I live, part of the week in Midtown Sacramento, and I can walk just a few blocks to get to a little corner bodega. There's no, it's really small. There's no parking lot. It's just this little neighborhood bodega where you can buy milk, you can buy paletas, you can get what you need until, 10:30 at night. And that I don't have to drive to a grocery store if I run out of milk, if my daughter's in town. And it's beloved by the community. I mean, people really love having this nearby. And yet we make that illegal in a lot of our neighborhoods, even though there's a lot of places we could put these. And, in a lot of our older areas, we have them. In Glendale, where I live, I'm near this area called Kenneth Village. It's beloved by the community. And yet you couldn't do that kind of commercial strip by, anywhere else right now because the zoning doesn't allow it. So can we find other opportunities for those kinds of very small pedestrian scaled commercial uses that allow people to not have to drive everywhere? And then active transportation infrastructure is really important. I love the Chandler bike path. So what are the opportunities for more of that kind of connectivity? So what 1147 does is it sets up a competitive grant program across the state for cities like Burbank and Glendale to apply to get grant money for those transformative active transportation projects that allow people to bike and walk safely within their communities to get where they need to go. I bike a lot in Sacramento to get to work. I ride my bike about 3.5 miles to get to work, but I do it because in Sacramento, I have protected bike lanes almost the entire way. I don't feel safe doing that other places. There's a lot of people like me, kind of the middle-aged women, let's say, who aren't spandex wearing, speed freaks on our bikes. Like we want to just have a safe way to bike a few miles, and poll after poll shows that there are people we want that. If you provide that, we will do that. So this bill would set up a fund to be used every year for that purpose. So that's a way that we can, in Sacramento, can help the cities achieve a lot of those climate goals. And I will say that land use is a really important part of sustainability. For those of you who are listening who care about climate change, California has gone in a great direction with a lot of its environmental goals. We are on the path to 100% clean energy generation in the state. We've got some barriers, but we're getting there more than almost any other state. But transportation has really lagged behind. So about 40% of California's greenhouse gas emissions come from the transportation sector. And I moved from chairing natural resources in the Assembly to chairing transportation because this was an area that I saw that we've been going constantly in the wrong direction. The amount of time people drive has gone steadily up over the years and not down. And this affects a lot of things. It does affect climate and emissions, but it also affects our health. And our risk of getting diabetes or going on dialysis increases year after year. And it's been going up. One of the reasons because we lead sedentary lifestyles, and our experience with our community where we get out of our cars and walk around and interact with people is challenged by always being in cars. And the places that people like to visit, whether it's downtown Burbank or downtown Glendale, are those environments where we can get out and we can walk around. Montrose, it's a great example. Here's a commercial strip that everybody loves because it is a pedestrian street. So we need to find ways of creating more of that environment and being able to reduce people's reliance on cars and investing in mass transit that works, like the Gold Line, like the Orange Line, mass transit that is convenient and that people take not because it's the transportation of last choice, because you just can't afford anything else, but because it's faster, more pleasant, and more convenient. The demographics for transportation in California, or in Los Angeles rather, are much different than the rest of the country. In San Francisco, Washington, D.C., and New York City, the demographics of people who ride transit mirrors the demographics of the community. The average person takes mass transit. In Los Angeles, poor people take mass transit because we've made it unpleasant, we've made it inconvenient for people, and we need to change that, and that requires state investment. And sorry, we're getting a little bit away from housing, but housing touches everything, and it all touches housing. And transportation and housing are linked because if we don't have good mass transit, we just can't keep adding more people. We've got to have ways of moving people around our community as we grow, and we have not. We're doing a lot right now, but we have to do a lot more to move people around our community. Otherwise, we're going to be paralyzed with gridlock.
And I know we have to get to the next question, but Assemblymember, I just want to piggyback and say, I think that you're 100% correct there. I have to give credit to all of my colleagues on the council, including Councilmember Springer, Councilmember Anthony, and so many others who have been proponents of public transit. And I just want to really bring this home to people. In my short tenure on the city council, I can't tell you all how many firefighters and police officers who serve our community every day cannot afford to live here, and they live elsewhere where they can't afford to own a home, or at least to provide for their family on the salary that they have. So I think that when we talk, and the reason I bring that up is that housing really is in hand with all of these other issues. Burbank has a nearly 3-to-1 jobs to housing ratio. My understanding is that pre-pandemic, we had an average of nearly 100,000 people commuting into our city for those jobs every single day. Now quantify that. Think about how many cars are on the road emitting pollutants. All of this really adds up. So when we talk about housing, in my view, I think you're absolutely on point, Assemblymember. We need to think of it as another solution towards solving our problems, and in meeting our sustainability goals of the future. So it all goes hand in hand. I know we're probably running behind. Let's get to that next question.
No problem. Thank you so much. No, those are great topics you guys are touching into. It's amazing. So now we're gonna jump into a little bit about, summer is here, and of course when summer comes, it gets really hot here in the valley. So the biggest issue is fire. So how should housing planning connect with fire adaptation?
Sure, I'll jump in. I've done a lot of work in this. Certainly when I was, chairing natural resources, fire and CAL FIRE was under, our jurisdiction. So I've done, and plus we are in a very fire impacted area in the 43rd district. So La Cañada Flint Ridge, which is in the 43rd district, is 100% in high fire severity zone. So you've got, tens of thousands of people living in areas that are at the highest risk of fire, unfortunately. And that's just getting worse every year because of climate change and drought. So this is something where, it may have seemed like a good choice to build in these areas 30, 40 years ago. But now, we see our communities being more and more at risk. And so this is something we need to think about. I personally believe that we should stop allowing development in high fire zones. I think it's just too risky. We have an issue where, of course, a lot of people live in high fire zones, and what happens when communities, maybe burn down. Nobody wants to tell people you can't go back to those communities, but we have to certainly, if we're going to do that, we have to make sure that what we build is extremely resilient in terms of the buildings itself, with updating fire codes. And just today, actually, in natural resources, we voted to again try to strengthen some of our building codes for high fire severity zones, so that what is built is the most sort of defensible because of fire. We need to make sure we have good ingress and egress, into communities, and that will mean sometimes going back in and really reevaluating those. We have done a bad job in the past. We've built in high fire zones of really taking into account the risk and building proper ingress and egress. And I have done legislation which was signed into law last year about defensible space. We need to make sure we fund that so that communities and residents have the resources to do defensible space requirements. Because when we think about risk from fire, what we think about often are sort of waves of fire moving through communities and just overwhelming everything. And that happens in some of the worst fires, but that is not typically the way that houses burn. And I could show you all, and I do town halls on fire, all the time. I can show photo after photo where people's yards were totally untouched. The trees are still green, the grass is green, and yet the structure was lost. And that's because the structure itself was not made fire resistant, and defensible space right around the building wasn't taken into account. So an ember of a bougainvillea that someone had planted against the building caught, an ember drifted maybe a mile, 2 miles, and ignited that branch. So we have to, certainly recognize that our fire risk is growing every year, and we need to put a lot more resources into prevention. And then in the past, the state's put most of its resources into fire suppression, but we have to look at prevention as well. And we need to stop trying to develop in fire prone areas. We need to stop building in our hillsides as much as we can. And I know that's tough for people, but we have to recognize that a lot of this, even under the best of situations, is just going to be, increasingly risky to build in these areas. And then we need to retrofit existing buildings so that they're more fire resistant. And again, how do we cooperate? We need to help cities like Burbank with their climate action plans and with the data. The fire maps are not updated, on a regular basis. Something else I've been trying to change at the state level. So council members like Mr. Schultz don't know where the fire risk is. That fire risk may have changed over time. And so they need to understand the severity of the fire risk. And we also need to reward communities that do fire risk reduction. So if we can find ways of giving, if communities put the investments in and reducing risk in those communities, they should have the reward of insurance rates coming down in those areas, so that the residents get, some reward for doing that risk reduction, beyond, just maybe sleeping better at night. So, I think we need to do a lot more work at the state level to help our local governments deal with fire risk.
And just to add on to that, I think one of the themes for the day is that, at least from my perspective, Assembly member, is that the more that the state can offer resources and guidance and ultimately allow local governments to make those on the ground decisions, I think we're all going to be better served for it. Because, and I know that having served in local government, you know this, but I know my community. I shop at the stores. I know my neighbors. I live here. So the decisions that I make impact me and everyone that I know. Now, on that note, what I would say is that you covered so many wonderful things. I'm not going to repeat it for the sake of time, but I would just add a couple things. For municipalities like Burbank that have our own utility, which we take great pride in, we're doing several things that I think are frankly above the grade. We are taking those wildfire mitigation steps. We actually have a service area that falls into the tier 2 category. So not the highest fire risk level, but an elevated level of risk. And we're making investments in covered conductors, where we have a composite pole pilot program where we're looking at replacing our existing utility poles in that area with composite material, which is more resistant to fire. We're looking at every available opportunity to prevent an ignition event. And that is the kind of investment that utilities can make in the context of drought as well, because we are dealing with hot climates. Just last night, actually, we were talking about our water management and contingency plans, how we're going to reduce water consumption in the event of drought and in the event of natural disaster. And where I think that the state can really help there is through the California Public Utilities Commission, offering guidance to municipalities, to utility providers that maybe aren't as far along as Burbank Water and Power, because we take great pride in planning for every available occurrence. And so I think that by partnering together, by building housing that makes sense, by investing in defensible space, and by making the investments to mitigate the risk of an ignition event, that is how we can incorporate all of this together into one effective strategy.
Great, thank you. That's amazing. So now the next question is regarding housing element. I guess that's a big thing right now that abundant housing is focusing a lot, is it's the housing element and how housing is going to be developed in the next 8 years. So for this question, how can we plan an equitable and impactful housing element?
Well, Assembly member, if you don't mind, I'll jump in there.
Sure.
And I apologize to everyone in advance. I might get a little wonky here, but there is, I think it's important to understand, how all of this fits together. So in the city of Burbank, and this is the same whether you live in Glendale or city of Los Angeles, we have a general plan. And that general plan takes into consideration a variety of factors. Housing is one of them. We have a housing element of the general plan. So when we talk about, equitable housing, we have to start there. And we have to make investments and strategies that are going to add housing that our people can afford. Look, we're going to have housing. We're going to have housing needs of a variety of levels, whether it's very low income, moderate, and market rate housing. Simply put, we have to make the investments so that we meet all of that demand. We're currently in the sixth, we're entering the 6th arena cycle. That's the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. And for those of you who don't know, the Assembly member mentioned earlier, we have the Southern California Association of Governments. They work to forecast the need for housing in Southern California, and then to provide guidance to municipalities like Burbank on what our need is going to be. Now, in the last cycle, which was the 5th cycle, so that's 2014 to 2021, Burbank was given an allocation of 2,684 units. I'm sorry to say that we didn't quite hit that target. We made investments of 115 non-deed restricted housing units for low income levels. We produced a total of 697 units. So we didn't quite make the mark. Now, as we look at the 6th cycle, the one number that sticks in my head every single day is 8,772. That's the units, that's the target that we need to hit for this next cycle of 2021 to 2029. But I can say that in Burbank's case, we've been very lucky. We've had an incredible and collaborative council that had that vision to think ahead and say, by 2035, we're going to add 12,000 units to hit that target and add a buffer. Now, how does all this play into, some of you might be familiar, or you might even be watching right now, the city's discussion of certain specific plans, whether it's the media district specific plan, the Golden State specific plan, the downtown Burbank transit oriented development or TOD specific plan. So the housing element is sort of our master blueprint, if you will. That's where we make these policies and we say we want to add housing by making it easier for design. We want to reduce costs where we can. Maybe we want to look at zone changes in certain parts of the city. But it's really the specific plan where we're getting into the nitty-gritty of what makes sense for each community, each part of our community. And that, my one call of action to all of you is that's where your voice can be heard. Please reach out to members of council. We want to hear your input. We want to hear what you think makes sense in the media district, downtown Burbank's future. And when we're looking at those areas, we're talking about where does it make sense to add growth and development? Does it make sense that the IKEA store sits vacant, or is there an opportunity there to add housing or some sort of mixed use development? These are the kinds of questions that we need to be asking. So I just want to add this part, and I want to give it back to the assembly member so she has a chance to add her 2 cents. But my personal thought on this is that when we talk about housing, we cannot just talk about market rate or luxury level housing, because that's not going to meet the demand. We need to meet all of our income demands. We need to provide housing that people can actually afford, because it goes back to what I said at the beginning. We want our children and our grandchildren to inherit a safe and livable and affordable city. But to do that, we do need to add housing, but in a way that makes sense. And again, I'm a firm believer that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can do that while still protecting some of our most cherished and iconic neighborhoods. We can protect single family residences in the Rancho, but we can also add housing where it makes sense, where we have the capacity to meet the supply increase in demand. And in doing so, by the way, we're going to have a better, more satisfied workforce. We're going to be taking cars off the road, which is going to have environmental impacts. I think if we do that, then we're really checking multiple boxes, if you will. We're adding housing that makes sense. We're giving people an affordable place to live. We're being environmentally conscious and friendly, and we're also doing it in a way that plans for Burbank's future. And this is the same process, by the way, that every community in California is going through right now. We are all in the process of getting our housing element certified by the Department of Housing and Community Development. So HCD is what we call it. They are reviewing our housing element to make sure that it makes sense. And the last point I will say, going back to this idea of local responsibility, we can't, in my view, just set a benchmark and hope we make it. Having annual reviews, making sure that we are making progress and identifying our weak spots. Where are we not making the progress that we hope to see, and making adjustments along the way? But I can't emphasize enough, community input and buy-in has to be part of the process, and part of that is events like today. And I want to thank you all again for showing up, because part of it is educating people on how complex and lengthy this process is. And so I hope that you will talk to your neighbors about this process and get involved, write council, talk to your council members, let us know what you'd like to see. But with that, Assembly Member, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Well, I don't really have a lot to add. I would just say that I think that all of us can look around our communities wherever we live and think about the places that we want to preserve that we think work really well right now, and be able to weigh in on that with our local city councils, our decision-making bodies, and then look at the areas and be honest about areas that really could be upgraded by adding housing. There's a lot of areas, whether it's in Glendale, I represent Los Angeles, like Western Avenue in Los Angeles, which to me is sort of a poster child of an area where absolutely nobody ever says, hey, honey, let's go take a stroll down Western Avenue today. There's a lot of opportunity to do the kind of development that was done in Los Feliz, along Hillhurst and Vermont, and sort of continue that sort of mixed use, vibrant kind of streetscape along Western Avenue and add housing. And I do think it's really important that city councils use their authority not just to add housing, but to do it in a way that's sensitive to communities, because the more that housing is added in a way that is additive and that fits in with the scale of communities, the less people will resist having new projects built. And when you build something that's too big and out of scale for the surrounding community, that's not close to job centers, it kind of ends up being a failure, and it creates a backlash. It's fine to add those larger buildings in areas where you already have the big buildings, you've got the giant job centers. And I think, then you would say, yeah, this fits in. And then there's other areas where, those buildings just are not appropriate. And that's why making those decisions at the local level and having input from the community as you do the general plans is important. So those general plans will guide those sorts of development patterns so that you don't have projects that are unexpected, that you set up the expectations for the community ahead of time of what this area will look like, potentially going into the future, and do it in a way that it upgrades the experience for everybody and upgrades the communities. And again, that can only be done at the local level. So I do think that it's important that the state makes sure, along with the regional planning entities like SCAG, that every city has goals and that those goals are met in a way that's equitable. And that's what the local planning groups currently do, with the state kind of helping sort of set what the goal is based on our projections of what growth will be in the community. But it really should be the local cities who direct how that growth happens and where and at what scale. So, people ask, what's my position on development and housing? That is my position in a nutshell. I come from local government, and I know that this should be something that is very much directed by the community and through the community. And, with sort of the state making, setting those goals and then giving the resources that are needed for things like infrastructure upgrades, to communities when they need them. And certainly things like mass transit to support this future growth is a place where the state really does need to act. And LA County has voted to tax itself for things like homelessness, like transit. And now we from the state need to, our partners, and, with Governor Newsom announcing a very large, $1 billion expenditure now within this year's budget to, kind of increase what LA is getting. And the federal government is also, I believe, going to help with their infrastructure budget, hopefully. Now, I will also say that the LA caucus, of which I'm a member in the legislature, has asked the governor for $5 billion for LA instead of $1 billion. I don't know that we'll get $5 billion, but it never hurts to ask when you have a budget surplus. But what we've asked for that money to go directly into transit, because there's so many transformative projects, whether it's connecting the red line with the gold line, or breaking ground finally on the Sepulveda Pass light rail project to get people off the 405. We need to really transform how people move around our community. And again, that's also to make sure that we can build the housing to accommodate people without having, all of the impacts of traffic. I can't even remember what the question was now, but I just wanted to get that out there.
That's fine. Thank you so much. So it seems like we need to build a lot of housing, but one of the biggest thing is it's our renter community. So how can we ensure renters are protected in the housing element of the process? I guess this is more for Nick Schultz, but if you want to jump in, Assemblywoman, you're more than welcome to jump in.
Well,
I could.
go ahead.
No, please.
Go ahead, Nick. No,
you-
please. No, council member, after you.
This is maybe the only time a council member will go before the assembly member, but I appreciate it. I think it goes back to the prior question in some ways about, an equitable approach to housing. We have to think about housing in many forms, right? We got to think about renting opportunities and creating home ownership opportunities. So, when we talk about housing and how we're going to add it to Burbank in a way that makes sense, personally, that's my perspective. I'm looking at it and I'm saying, okay, how many home ownership opportunities and affordable home ownership opportunities are we actually bringing to the table? Because again, the average home price in Burbank is going through the roof, and my concern is future generations. I can't tell you how many of my neighbors I've talked to whose kids and grandkids have moved out of state or moved far away, and they just can't afford to be here. And that's heartbreaking to me. I grew up and I was close with my grandparents. I was close with my mom, and that is what I want to see for our community. I am not naive enough to think that it's as simple as supply and demand. There are many, many factors here, but certainly adding to our stockpile of affordable housing options is going to be part of the solution. Now, when we talk about including renters, we have to make sure that we're adding to that stockpile of available housing too. And we do have some protections in place for renters already. I think the assembly member could speak a little bit more to the impact of 1482. That's Assembly Bill 1482 for everyone who's following. But there are protections in place that limit the annual increases for rent, that have certain eviction protections. So I think that, again, that's an example where Sacramento has created a baseline, and then it's up to local jurisdictions to decide if there's ways to tinker that or to make it more narrowly tailored to the needs of our community. But again, when we're talking about housing supply and adding to it, we need to make sure that we're not just investing in one category of housing, that we're not just investing in rental housing, that we're investing in home ownership opportunities, And then within those two categories, we're looking at the different income level brackets. Of course, there's going to be market rate, moderate income housing, but we have to make sure that if we're going to hit our target of 8,772, that we hit all of those sub-targets in there. Because if we don't do that, then we're not doing it in the most equitable way that we can. But Assemblymember, I'd like to hear your thoughts as well.
No, I agree. Everyone deserves housing. And, one of the causes of gentrification is when people who are, upper income, more privileged renters can't find units. When they can't find housing, they push into more disadvantaged communities often. And that leads to displacement and gentrification. So there's reasons to provide housing really at every level. And, today's market, today's affordable housing, and I'm not saying affordable in terms of subsidized housing, but I'm talking about your older units that are more affordable, or yesterday's luxury units. Something that was built 50 years ago, that was the latest and greatest luxury apartment, now is an apartment that's considered to be affordable. So, just because it's new doesn't, and it's being built now, and it seems like it's luxury, and maybe it is, down the road that would probably be a more affordable unit. So we need to look at every single level, and we do need to find ways for people to build for what they call the missing middle. There are developers who want to build middle-class housing, believe it or not, but it's really hard to when you look at the economics, given the cost, really high cost of land in Los Angeles and in our areas like Burbank and Glendale. And then what it costs to build. And right now it's really expensive to build. I mean, any of you who've looked at doing a home renovation know that the prices of lumber, the price of labor, all of that's been skyrocketing. And that also means that the cost of building an apartment goes up, and it's much harder for that unit to be rented, even to middle class or upper middle class people. And that's a problem. And that's something that we've been looking at the state. I've sat on a select committee for several years now about building for the missing middle. And we've been exploring a lot of different options of bringing those costs down for builders so that they can build middle class housing. So that is certainly important. And then in terms of what we consider to be the real affordable housing being the subsidized housing, of course, we need to find more dedicated funding sources. Now, when I was on the city council, for the first part of my city council in Glendale, we had redevelopment agencies. We had the tool of redevelopment where cities were able to capture tax revenue from redevelopment areas, from blighted areas, and put that back into affordable housing. And Glendale built a lot of subsidized housing that's now rented to seniors, low-income residents. We have a returning veterans housing project that we built. We have a cerebral palsy housing that we built for people with severe physical disabilities. So this is housing that's really important. And when redevelopment was taken away by the state, an effort that I spent a year lobbying unsuccessfully against, we lost that funding source at the local level. And we have never really replaced it. So there is some money available, and there's a lot more in this year's budget for affordable housing, but we need an ongoing and steady stream of money for that kind of subsidized housing. And yet, even with that, it's never going to be enough for everyone. And a lot of our residents are not going to qualify, because that affordable housing is really for people at the very bottom of the income spectrum. So it is important for our service workers, for our seniors, for others. But what about the young professional who's making, let's say my staffers, at the assembly, I hate to confess, we pay people like $35,000 a year coming in. That's just what they get paid. Maybe they go up to 40, 45,000. Where do they live? Where do people who are working entry-level jobs live in our community? Where does a young family where, you have one person's maybe staying home with a child and the other spouse is making even $80,000 a year, $90,000 a year. If you're paying 40% of that rent, 40% of that income to rent, and then you have taxes, you have the cost maybe of some childcare, there's not much left over there. There's not much left over to save for your kids' college. There's not much to save for a rainy day. There's certainly not enough to save for a down payment on a house. So we need the affordable housing, the subsidized housing, but we also need to build for that missing middle. And that's a real challenge.
Yes, I'm really glad you mentioned that.
Oh, and I'm sorry, Nick asked specifically about some legislation that we have done at the state level to protect renters. So I do just want to mention a few things. AB 1482 passed in 2019, which is basically statewide rent stabilization until 2030. It restricts landlords from increasing rents for existing tenants more than 5% per year plus inflation, which is approximately 8% a year. And it also prohibits the owner of a residential property from terminating the lease of a tenant who's occupied the property for at least 12 months without cause. That's something that was very difficult to get through the legislature, believe it or not, but a very important piece of tenant protection that will help prevent what we saw in Glendale prior to that, which was people who had their rents increased 100% in 1 month or 30% month after month, people who weren't being given year-long leases and saw their rents just constantly going up. And currently the legislature is negotiating a $5.2 billion plan to pay landlords all of what they're owed for back rent that tenants may have not been able to pay because of impacts from the COVID-19 pandemic, while at the same time giving those same renters a clean slate. And we're also debating on whether to extend the restrictions on evictions that we currently have because of COVID past June. And then the LA County Board of Supervisors voted just this last Tuesday to extend an eviction moratorium through the end of September. So we have been working on tenant protections as well as housing production, because all of that is very, very important. And in money going directly into homelessness prevention and into emergency shelters. We could have a whole conversation about homelessness, certainly more money going into mental health, substance abuse issues, looking at the root cause of homelessness. We really need to do a much better job, at every level, preventing people from slipping into homelessness, because once people are on the streets, they are very difficult and very expensive to serve and get off the streets.
Great, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're very short in time right now. We already passed 7:05, but unfortunately, we didn't get in time for our Q&A. But before we end this town hall discussion, any of you like any closing remarks before we end the discussion?
Well, let me just thank you once again for giving us this opportunity. I want to thank the council member for joining me. Again, I think that it's really important that communities have the ability to preserve things that make their community special. And I'll just call out the Pickwick Center right now, which I know is under threat of development. As much as we need housing, we also shouldn't lose things that are really, not just beloved in the community, but that provide real recreation opportunities. Pickwick is a place where people learn to roller skate, where my kid goes bowling, where I go to, the antique, fair there every single month, little plug there. It's something that really adds to our community. And so we need to be able to preserve those kinds of amenities and then look at things that really don't add to the community, that are blighted, that, that are opportunities like vacant commercial buildings, instead. So I think that that's where, the local control really is key, and being able to use their land use authority, sort of for the greater good. And, I think that the cooperation between local government and state is, incredibly important. And I also want to say that I know that there's a lot of very controversial housing bills, as they always are every single year. And I want to say that now is the time for people in the community to weigh in, to reach out to me and let me know your opinion on these subjects. Let my staff know your opinion. We've been having meetings with stakeholders all across the district. Just today, I spent an hour talking to our various homeowners associations about their impressions of different bills that are moving through the legislature. And I want to say that I love that input. I want you to keep it coming, and let us know what you think at all times. We want to hear from you. And again, thanks so much for this opportunity.
Well, thank you so much, woman. Now, I guess you want to close it off, Nick Schultz, Councilman?
Well, thank you very much. Seriously, thank you to Abundant Housing LA for hosting this. Thank you to the Assembly member for joining me today. And I just want to say, I really hope that that Abundant Housing has the chance to do this with all the members of our council, because I think that you'll get a really great cross section of the different perspectives that we bring. But if there's one takeaway for everyone who's still on, the 74 or so participants, I would say this. On a personal note, I see the problem for what it is, and I also see the opportunity for dialogue and conversation. I feel like in general, as a society, we have done a lot of talking at one another. But to really solve this problem, which is decades in the making, we have to talk with each other. That means that we as local leaders in Burbank need to be active and talk with our assembly member, with our senator, with our supervisor, and advocate for the needs of our community. And they need to listen. But in the same way, they need to be able to come to us and say, these are the goals that we have to meet regionally or statewide, and we have to listen as well. we have to partner together to get through this thing, because this is a problem that is bigger than any of us, and no one person has all the answers. But the one thing I want people to know is I am dead serious about getting this done. We have to solve this crisis, and we will together, whether it's housing, whether it's homelessness. And there are great solutions right here in Burbank that fit our community need. And there'll be solutions that are unique to Glendale and La Cañada. And everyone should find what works for them. But we all have to be united in the sense that the time is now to act. And so I would just say there are so many amazing questions. I'm just getting the chance to look at the Q&A. So many questions that we didn't have a chance to answer. I would just say, whether you're a Burbank resident or not, if there's something that you would like me to answer, if you want to have a conversation about it, if you want to go grab a cup of coffee, you can reach me at nschultz@burbankca.gov. It's the first letter of my first name, my last name, all one word, at burbankca.gov. But this is local government at its finest. We are accessible to you. I want to talk to you. I want to hear your perspective. Stay engaged, stay involved, and have a good night.
Thank you, Nick Schultz. That was great. But yeah, if you guys have any questions that we're not able to answer, please send them out to the councilman. We really want to hear from you. And unfortunately, we didn't have time for a Q&A, but short time. Housing is such a big problem here in California. So thank you all for joining tonight, and thank our panelists for being here tonight. And I hope you guys have a good night.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.